For this talk, this is probably the most tired I've ever been giving a conference talk, so naturally we're going to be in live code the whole time. But I wanted to walk through some Laravel 5.5 stuff, which, in case you've been out of the loop, Laravel 5.5 is probably coming out tomorrow during the day sometime. And there's been some new stuff that was announced at Laracon US, like Laravel Horizon. Has anyone checked that out? So that's a UI for your queue system, and also demoed a few other features there. And I want to walk through some features here that I didn't show there that are new since Laracon US, because there is some cool stuff actually that has come into the framework since then that I haven't had a chance to talk about. So to get the important stuff out of the way, as Jeffrey Way brought up at Laracon US, the questions I know everyone will ask is, which color scheme is this in Sublime Text? That's GitHub inspired, which is on package control. And the next important question is, which font is this? And this is the Operator Mono font, which is kind of a cool little font, has some cursive letters and stuff. Anyway, so I've kind of got this routes file, and we'll just kind of work through it to look at these features. Is that big enough for... Is that good now? All right, so I've got some notes here on my phone, so I'm just going to kind of look at those as I walk through this to remind me all the stuff I wanted to show you, because there's quite a few things here. Starting kind of small, I wanted to show you this new helper that's relatively new in Laravel 5.5 called Optional. And the whole purpose of Optional is to sort of clean up some conditional logic that you might have in your templates or other parts of your app. So if we look at this route, at the very top of it, I'm just dumping out the current user. And if I hit it in my browser, we'll see that it's currently null. And I'll just make this a lot bigger because we'll be in here quite a bit. And so something you might run into a lot is you have to do something like this, where if auth user and auth user some method, that kind of song and dance. And in Laravel 5.5, this optional helper can be kind of useful because you can pass it any object and then call a method or access like an attribute or a property or something. And you will never really get an error that that's null, or you're trying to access a method on null. So if this doesn't exist, if this object is null, then this method will also just return null. It's sort of like a black hole that you can just call methods on. So it's just a small little thing I wanted to point out because I haven't had a chance to mention it yet, but it can kind of clean up your if statements a little bit to where you don't have to do that kind of double check to see if it's set. And then it's also sort of useful in Blade templates, because I see this kind of thing a lot too, where like people are maybe trying to determine what CSS class to put on a HTML block. And they have to do kind of a similar thing where they check, if this is not null and this is true, then use this class. And now you can just kind of simplify that to sort of one statement instead of having the and, combining the two. Anyway, so if I call this now, if I comment out this dump, we should fall all the way down here to did nothing. We shouldn't get any errors about there not being a method on that null. So anyway, check that out if that looks useful to you for cleaning up some stuff. All right, now in Laracon US, of course, introduced Horizon, which actually some people, I just got a tweet the other day, had never heard of Horizon, believe it or not, even though it was kind of a big deal at Laracon. But what it is it's a UI for your Redis-based queues in Laravel. It's also a configuration system so that all of your queue configuration lives in your Laravel project. So just to give you a quick example, if you haven't checked it out yet, you have a Horizon config file where you actually define like what queues you want your application to work, how many tries it can try a certain job, or sort of the maximum amount of attempts you can make on a job, how many total processes do you actually want working your queues, and all of that, which would normally live like in a supervisor configuration file, is now brought into source control and sort of lives inside your project. And it's kind of a similar thing to what we did with cron, with Laravel Scheduler, except this is for queues. Okay, so that's the configuration is kind of one half of it, and then the UI is the other half of it. But there's some other cool new queue features that I want to show you too. And the first one is this idea of time-based expirations. So currently in Laravel jobs, if you want to say, you would define like a maximum number of attempts that looks something like this. I want this job to be attempted 99 times before it just fails. Or, I mean, usually it's a lower number, but that's the kind of thing you could do. And that becomes cumbersome in some situations, which we'll see later. So in Laravel 5.5, you can now just have a method that is retry until, where you say, I want to keep retrying this job until a given point in the future. Because the number of attempts you're going to make might be sort of hard to calculate or unknown. And it's easier to just say, I want to try this job for a maximum of 30 minutes, and if it doesn't complete by then, we're going to put it in the failed jobs table. So a really simple method that just returns, in this case, a Carbon instance with 5 seconds in the future. And if I go ahead and, I'll go ahead and start up a Horizon worker here so we can take a look at it. And then if I push that job onto the queue, we'll see it time out after around 5 seconds or so. I'm going to do this on another tab. So this is what Horizon looks like when a job is pending, and then in a few seconds, the job will time out. So that's another approach to how you can deal with job timeouts. All right, and then there's 2 new features in Queue around rate limiting. So we haven't had any rate limiting for jobs at all, which is something that exists in other sort of professional queuing systems that are commercial or paid. And we wanted to bring this into Laravel because it can be pretty useful if you're working with systems that maybe your queue jobs call an API that has a rate limit, and you need to also rate limit your jobs to make sure you're not constantly bombarding their API. So this is, again, a feature that is sort of exclusive to Redis, and the reason for that is Redis is fast and atomic at these kind of operations, and it's also fairly easy to scale and works with Amazon Elasticache and stuff like that. So it's a good option for these kinds of things that are very, need to be very precise and can't have race conditions in them and stuff like that. So for rate limiting, what this looks like is I have a rate limited job, and in this case, I want to allow this job to run one time every 5 seconds. So that's going to limit this job to only that running that frequently. And if I'm able to acquire the lock, it will run the logic that's in this callback. If I can't acquire the lock, then I want to run the logic that's in sort of this second callback, which is like my failure callback. So if I can't acquire the lock, I'll just release this job back onto the queue with a delay of 10 seconds and say, we'll give this a shot again in 10 seconds and see if we can acquire the lock then. Okay, and this key right here can be really any arbitrary value. So realistically, it would probably be like some kind of job name and then maybe the ID of the model you're operating on or something to sort of identify this type of job. All right, so I'll go ahead and fire some of those out onto the queue. In this case, I'm going to put 10 on the queue, and we really should see them work sort of slowly, even though I've got multiple processes running, which normally you would expect, kind of 3 jobs to finish at a time since I have 3 processes. But we'll see these finish more, one at a time because of the rate limiting. So let's hit that route. And we have the 10 jobs out here, and we'll see them kind of start completing slowly. But you can see they're rate limited. They're not completing in sort of chunks like you would expect if they were not rate limited. All right, and there's a second kind of rate limiting, which is kind of concurrency based. This is where you can say, I want only, let's say, 3 instances of this job to be running simultaneously. So a real world example of this, for example, like in Forge or something, would be we have Forge jobs that update like Nginx configurations or restart PHP FPM, and we really only want one job at a time restarting PHP FPM on any given server. Because if you have a bunch of jobs competing to restart FPM, you can kind of get FPM in this, you can basically get it in this error state where it's not running at all. So I have this concurrency limited job, which is a different approach. And this uses some similar syntax where we're still using Redis, and we can say Redis funnel, because we want to make a funnel to limit the amount of jobs that are kind of entering the processor or the workers at once. And again, we have a key that could be a class name or keyed by a model ID or something like that. In this case, I'm just going to limit it to one job running at a time of this type. And I'll just write something to my log if I get the lock. Otherwise, kind of the same thing. I'm going to release it back onto the queue so we can try again. And this is one of those cases where it would be really useful to have the retry until method, because you don't really know how long it's going to be before you can acquire a lock. You might try your job 10 times before a lock becomes available. So it's a little bit easier to think of it in terms of a time-based timeout instead of an attempts-based timeout, because you could have a lot of attempts without something necessarily being wrong. All right, so we can go ahead and fire 10 of those out onto the queue. And again, we'll see them work pretty slowly since we're only running one at a time. It should be kind of a similar thing to the other rate limit. So I will run the concurrent route. And again, we have 10 more jobs. And they'll eventually, there go a few. They'll eventually start processing. And this updates every 5 seconds. So you could see a few process at the same time here since it's updating kind of slowly. So that is 2 approaches to rate limiting that's going to be available in Laravel 5.5. So hopefully that's helpful to you if you've ever run into that situation where you needed to rate limit jobs or limit them in terms of how many can run at the same time or that kind of thing. All right, let's see. Let me scroll down in my notes here. All right. A quick side note related to this is if you do use Redis, so we already have a throttle middleware, which allows you to throttle the amount of requests hitting like a certain route or a group of routes, which many of you probably use on your APIs already. But there's a new version of that middleware. If you want to take advantage of it, it's an optional thing that will give better performance if you're using Redis, because it uses some of the new capabilities we built into this that we use for this queue lock or rate limiting system. And all you have to do is in your HTTP kernel, come down to your throttle middleware and just change this to throttles request with Redis. And that's really the only change you have to make because the middleware sort of API is the same as far as declaring it on your route. And I've got it set to allow 3 requests per minute. And if I hit this, 3 times, I'll get too many requests. But consider that if you're using Redis or you're interested in Redis, because it makes less round trips to the Redis server to implement the behavior. So it will be a little more performant for you. All right, moving on from queues and stuff, I want to talk about Carbon a little bit, which is something that's used a lot throughout the framework. And Carbon as a library, it's right now kind of locked on PHP 5.3, which kind of limited what we could do with it because it doesn't implement, for example, like JSON serializable and stuff like that. So for 5.5, we actually extended Carbon with our own Illuminate support Carbon, which lets us do fancier Laravel type things with it. So one of those is we can now define like macros on Carbon, and which will work throughout your app and will be used by your Eloquent models and things like that. So in this example, I'm just defining a macro called Unix to get the Unix timestamp, and then returning now, which is a helper in Laravel 5.5 to get one of these new Illuminate support Carbon instances, and I'll just get the Unix timestamp for the current, or for now, plus 1 year. And it's just a nice way to sort of add more readable methods to your Carbon instances, especially like if you add sort of domain-specific methods to your Carbon instances, it can be kind of nice. And then there's also a today helper to complement now if you just need the current date, not the current date time. And another useful addition is Carbon serialization. So we actually did implement JSON serializable on our Carbon instance. And so like normally if you return a Carbon instance, this is probably what you're used to in terms of output. So you get like a little JSON object here with like date, time zone type, and time zone. And now you can really easily customize that throughout your app. So if I go to here and uncomment this, there's a new serialized using method that takes a Carbon or a closure that receives a Carbon instance. And from here, you can format your Carbon instance any way you want. And this is what will be used whenever you're returning Carbon instances as JSON, through your API or whatever. So now if I run this same code, I get a different format for my Carbon date. And so I think that's pretty useful because I was always kind of annoyed by that, not having an easy way to customize that serialization. Responsible objects, which is something I didn't get a chance to talk about at all, and which I think is pretty cool. So responsible is a new interface in Laravel 5.5, and it's a really simple interface. It just has one method called toResponse that takes a request, and all it does is return a response. And it lets you do some kind of interesting things because you can return any object from a route or controller that implements this interface. So, for example, I've got a simple object here that implements responsible, and it just returns hello responsible from its toResponse method. But what that lets me do is return it, directly from a route or controller. So if I hit this responsible route, I can just return new some response. And I get the response that we would expect. And why that's cool is it can be used to build sort of interesting things. And what I built with it that I wanted to primarily show you during this talk is a model transformation layer for your APIs. So many of you probably pull in a package for this. Like, do many of you use like Fractal or something like that to transform your APIs? Okay, or something to kind of format your model into an array that is going to be served out as JSON through your API. So people usually have a translation layer a lot of times. So this is all implemented using responsible, and I call it resources because I don't really like using the word like transformers or other like words like that. I would rather just call them like a user resource or a user collection or something like that. So what it looks like is there's a new artisan command called make resource, which you can use to make new, oops, getting smaller, make new classes that are resources. It just looks something like this, like say I have a flight or something, and you'll end up with a flight resource in your app HTTP resources directory. And this is where you can kind of transform your model into an array that's going to be served by your API. All right, but I've got several examples here I want to walk through of what you can do with this. And in this example, I am just doing kind of the most basic thing. I just have a user model. I'm going to get one instance of the user model and then pass it to my new user resource. And because these resources implement the responsible interface I just showed, I can just return these directly from my routes or controllers. And they'll be rendered into proper JSON responses. Now, if I look at my user resource, my toArray method just sort of formats the attributes I want in the array. So, for example, I don't have the password in here because we don't want to serve that over our API. But I have the basic information like name, email, and the created at dates and stuff like that. All right, and that's really all my resource needs to do is provide that array. All right, so now if I hit this route, we get a nice JSON representation of that user that we can serve over our API. And of course, if we want, we can combine this with the Carbon serialization stuff by uncommenting that, and now we have these dates formatted how we need to. All right, so that's sort of the most basic example of how to use a resource. Now, another quick example I wanted to show you is if you return a resource for a newly created model, it will automatically set the proper status code for you because it knows that model was created during the current request cycle. So in this example, I'm returning a new resource that takes a new user that was just created using like a model factory, and we'll check the status code on that response. So that route was create. Let's go to network. When we create a new model, you can see right here, it's very small. There's a 201 created response. So that's all set for you if you return a newly created model. Now, of course, we're not always returning single models. We need to be able to return collections of models. And there's two ways to do this that I want to show you. So sometimes you may not need to customize what that collection looks like if it has metadata or something like that. If you don't really have that, and you just want sort of a list of using your standard resource class, you can just call the collection method right on your resource. So return user resource collection, pass it a collection of models, and they will all be formatted according to our user resource that I just showed you. So if we hit this route, we're going to get, pretty much what we would expect: an array of users, our dates are formatted how we said, stuff like that. Okay, so that's the first way to return a collection that doesn't really require any extra customization for your API. But some collections do require customization, and you can actually make a whole resource just to represent a collection, which turns out to be pretty powerful. So what this looks like out of the box is my user collection. By default, the stub is just going to do the default parent to array, which is going to look like what we just saw, just a standard array of user resources. All right, so if I hit that route, it's shouldn't really change from what we just saw. It looks basically exactly the same. But what we can do is we can add other data in with this. So, like for example, some API specs require you to have links or something like that. So we can customize what that's going to look like. So I'm going to put my collection. When you're in a resource collection, you can access the collection at this collection. I'm going to put that on data, and then maybe I have some extra links here. Some link value. We'll get rid of that. And let's return this now. And if I come down here, now I have some extra metadata along with this collection of users. So it's very easy for me to add this. All right, now sometimes I've tried to make this really flexible to handle lots of different cases, but still keep it really simple. So sometimes there's metadata that you want to add to an API response, but you only really want to include it with the API response on the top level of the resource that you're returning, so to speak. So maybe you don't want links if this user collection is nested in some other resource response, if that makes sense. And so how we can do that is, I'm going to change this back to just return this collection, which is basically the same as return parent to array. But what we can do here is there's a method called with. And let me scroll down here to my notes. So in this example, I'm going to load in a relationship and show you how that works as well. So we have a user collection. We're going to load all the users, and then we're going to eager load in all the roles. All right, and on our user collection, or let's go to our user resource, because we need to actually show these roles, in our user resource. Like if I call this now, we shouldn't really see the roles because we didn't define those in our resource. So they're not going to be served through our API. All right, but if we go to our user resource, let's add them right here. And what this looks like is in my app HTTP resources, I have a role resource. So I'm just going to use role collection because I don't really have a role collection that represents a collection specifically. So I'm just going to use the default behavior. And I can just pass this roles here. So that's like the basic example of how I would include a relationship in my resources. So let's hit that. And now we have roles. And you can see this has a role of ID1 and editor for this user. And if we look at that role resource, that's because we're returning, ID and name. So that's why that's formatted in that way. All right. Now let's define a with or some top-level metadata that we only want to be returned when this is the outermost resource being returned. So let's do that right here on role. So we're not going to add it into array, because if we add metadata here, it's going to be every time we return that resource. But using the with method, let's return meta key value. All right, let's hit that. And as you can see, we don't really see it here because we're not at the top level. The user collection is the top level. So now let's return roles as the top level resource. So here's a role resource. Let's return that. And now we do get that metadata that we wanted on the outside layer of that resource. And you can do whatever you want in that with method. You receive the HTTP request, you have the resource, you can kind of inspect it and see what you want to set in that data. All right, and there's a second way to do this from outside the resource if you need to, where maybe you only know the metadata in your controller for some reason or something like that, where I can return a user collection and then call the additional method to add additional metadata to the outside of that response. And that's just another way of doing the same thing, just from a different location. If for some reason you can't do it within your resource, it doesn't really fit the use case right or something. So if I return this, go way down here, we have the metadata on the outside of that resource. All right, so that's a little bit about how you would deal with metadata and stuff. Now, another cool thing about collections is they automatically handle pagination for you, so you don't really have to worry about that metadata. So I'm going to return a new user collection, and remember, we haven't really modified our user collection to know anything about pagination at this point. And let's just see what happens as the default behavior. All right, so we have data, and if we come down, we have a new links object that has first, last, previous, and next, and that's just following sort of the JSON API naming scheme for naming links. And then we also have a meta section which has the stuff you're used to from the paginator, current page, where are we starting from, the last page, all that good stuff. So all of that is handled for you. And what's kind of cool is if I come into user collection and say I also had links here. So I'm going to have, data as my collection, and I'm going to add links here. Self value. If I do this, let's see what happens. I come down to links. So you can see that any links you add are just merged in, so you don't have to worry about overriding the paginator's data. So it's just really clean, and it will just work out of the box kind of how you would want it to work, really. All right, I'm going to go ahead and, again, just get that back to kind of how I had it so it doesn't clutter up any of our other examples here. All right. So yeah, pagination just kind of works out of the box, which is nice because you can pass a pagination instance or a paginator instance or a collection to one of your collection resources and just have it kind of work the same either way. You don't really have to be concerned about which one you're handling. I want to talk a little bit about data wrapping, and you've probably noticed on these responses that all of them so far have been wrapped with data on the outside. And again, that's fully customizable. So if you don't really like your APIs having that data key on the outside, you can just call resource without wrapping. And I'm doing this in a route, but you would really do this like in an app service provider or some like global spot within your application. And then if I return a user collection, in this case, I'm going to load in their blog post or something, we shouldn't have any wrapping at all on the outside. So in this case, it looks just like a standard JSON array and just a list of objects. All right, and let's go ahead and actually add that post relationship in here while we're on this. I'm going to change this to post. And in this case, I actually do have a custom post collection. So I'm just going to say new post collection, this post, and we'll have their blog post in there. And no wrapping on the outside. Now, if you wanted your interior resources to have wrapping, you would just add those on the collection. So you have full control. If you have a custom collection, of course, if you came in here and added data, then those posts are also going to be wrapped with data. So I wanted to make it really flexible because I feel like there's a lot of different opinions on what that should look like, but it's generally really easy to get that looking however you want it to look. All right, and then let's see. If you have wrapping on and you're also putting data on your nested resources, I didn't want you to ever have to worry about how nested you are. So for example, like if I have a post collection and I'm returning a data key here on my post collection, what about when this is the outermost resource and we haven't disabled wrapping? You might expect to have a double data key, data, and then your post. But Laravel will actually check for that so that for your outermost resource, it will never let you double wrap your data. So you can if you want the data key throughout your responses, you can always just return it, and you can just sort of rest assured that Laravel is not going to let you do something stupid and have 2 data keys on your responses. So it's just another thing you don't really need to worry about or think about. And now one last thing about wrapping is with pagination, even if you disable wrapping, with a paginated instance, you always are going to have a data key, just like you do now with the standard paginated responses. And that's because you're always going to have the links and metadata down here at the bottom, and we don't really want those mixed in with your model resources. So that's always kind of separated, and there's really no way around that because it would become confusing if they were mixed together. All right, so that's how you would customize sort of how your data looks in terms of that data key. All right, now another kind of neat feature of this, which the community could kind of take advantage of, is that resources can return a JSON serializable object. So for example, if you were writing a package to format all of your resources according to JSON API spec, this would be a kind of a unique way to go about it, and I think would work pretty well. So what I would do is I would make a package that has these classes like JSON API resource that implements JSON serializable, which is just a built-in PHP interface, and does whatever it needs to do with the resource to get it looking how JSON API wants it. And then what you can do is in that user collection or in that user resource, I'm just going to return new JSON API, what was it called? JSON API resource. I'm going to pass it the resource. And now if I hit that serialized route that is returning our user collection, you can see they're formatted according to that JSON serializable object. So someone could build a package, that you consume within your resources that looks something like this, where you're returning a new JSON API resource and passing it the resource and letting it handle getting all of the relationships and includes and links and all of that stuff right. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, keep that in mind and take advantage that you can return any JSON serializable object from a resource and it will just automatically be transformed into JSON for you. All right. Customizing the response, so things like headers and stuff like that on your API responses. There's a couple different ways you could do it. One is to call the response method just as you're returning any resource, and that will give you the full Illuminate/HTTP/response object where you can add headers and set status codes and stuff like that. So in this case, I can add a custom header, this xconference header. And we'll see that custom header down here in tiny font, xconference Laracon EU 2017. So that's one way you can interact with headers on the response. There's another way that you can do it right on the resource if you kind of prefer that approach, where on the user collection, I could actually have a with response method that receives the response we're dealing with, and I could add a header here. All right, so that's just another approach to doing the same thing. And then if I hit that route and check out those headers, I see my custom header down there. So it's up to you what approach you kind of want to take with that. Sometimes it might make sense to sort of set your headers along with your resource, and sometimes you might want to do it from a route or controller. But those are the 2 ways you could do it. All right. Now, cleaning up conditionals, and this is probably one of my favorite parts of this whole feature, actually, because I feel like if this didn't exist, it would kind of spoil it for me. So a lot of times when I see people transforming their models to arrays for like serving over their API, it kind of looks like this song and dance right here, where they're in their user resource, and they're checking, like, they'll initialize the array like this maybe, and then you have to do some kind of condition here to add something else to the array. Has anyone ever done this kind of thing? It's like the most garbage stuff like you would ever want to do, right? And it's kind of hard to know how to get around it. And this was really key for me to figure out. Like, I just wanted to find sort of like one expression, if possible, to return this resource. And I didn't want to do that whole conditional song and dance every time I had some thing that depended on some other condition to whether it gets in the resource array. So there's actually several helpers to help you get around this. So let's say we have some secret value that we only want to show when a given condition is true. Like in this case, let's pretend we only want to show a value when the isAdmin method of my user eloquent model returns true, which in this case it is hard-coded to true. All right, and we have some secret thing. Now, we could do something like this, where we do this admin, and again, this is proxies down to the underlying resource. I'm not sure if I mentioned that earlier, but you can access things on your resource as if it was the eloquent model itself. So this is just proxying down to the eloquent model. And of course, we could do something like this, where we have secret value, otherwise it's null. And then you kind of, of course, when you hit that, you get that secret key every time, or if it's if it's false, which is kind of the worst case, we get null every time, and users sort of see that value that you didn't really want to expose at all if you didn't have to. So what you can do, instead of that whole conditional thing where you sort of build the array in multiple steps, we can just say this when this admin secret value. All right, and now if it's not an admin, let's see what happens, because we hard-coded that to false. And in this case, the secret key is just entirely removed from the array if the when did not evaluate its condition to be true. So it cleans up that whole conditional thing. And now sometimes you might want to do this with multiple values. So we might have multiple values that depend on this condition being true. And in this case, like it might look something like this. We'll say this merge when, this admin, and then we have sort of an array of values. Secret 1 is this value, and secret 2 is this value. Now we don't see these at all when that condition is not true. But when it is true, they're just merged into our array as if they were there the whole time, basically. So it's a really expressive way to build out your array without if this, then that, add this to the array here, blah, 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 and then finally return. So it's sort of one return statement. All right. And this could also take a closure, actually. If you need to do some like expensive calculation that you don't want to do at all, unless it's true, you could do something like this. Like if, I don't know what you would do that's expensive, but like if you had to make a DB call for some wild whatever reason, and you didn't want to do that like directly in the array because it was just going to execute immediately, you could pass a callback to merge when so that you can kind of defer that. And that just sort of does the same thing if you return an array. And you can get pretty gnarly in here, like you could have a when here and get rid of that. So there's weird stuff you can do. Keep it in check a little bit, but I'm just saying you can kind of combine them in interesting ways. All right, so that's how you would merge values in based on some conditional. Now, this also gets really useful in relationships. So what if I want to always show the blog posts for the users in this response? So one way would be to do something like this, where, like I did earlier, I had a new post collection, this post, and now we get the post. Let me load that relations route to make sure I'm on the right route. We get the post every time. And this can cause problems as well because it can sort of lead to N+1 problems on your API transformers where every user is pulling all of its posts individually and you're sort of not eager loading when you could be on your relationship. So you're going to have a lot of extra database queries. And I wanted to get around this too in a sort of expressive way. And so I built a helper that looks like this, where we return a new post collection, but we say when loaded posts, so that I only want to include the posts when they've already been loaded, when they're already on this user. And now if I do this, I don't get the posts because I never loaded them in my controller. So there's no reason to pull them. But now if I comment this out and I return a user collection with all of the users and I eager load in all their posts, then we should get the posts because they were loaded on the user at the time. So it's another really expressive way to only do things when certain conditions are true without breaking up your transformation into multiple steps. All right, and the same thing with pivot or intermediate tables on many-to-many relationships. So we had that roles thing I showed you earlier, where that's a many-to-many relationship between users and roles. And there's that intermediate table in the middle that's like role users that has some information. And in this case, mine has an expiration date that shows when that user is no longer going to have that role. Let's pretend that roles expire in the system or something. So that's stored on the intermediate table that joins the two tables together. So now if I load, let's go to our user resource and add the roles in. We'll change this. This is going to be role collection. We're going to pass in when loaded roles. And then on our role thing, on our role resource, we're not always going to have that pivot data. So like, for example, let me move this up. If I return all of the roles in the role resource, this is not connected to users at all, right? It's just the collection of roles, so there's no expiration date to show because we're not even talking about users at this point. We're just showing the available roles in the system. All right, and so we're just going to get that. And so, but if that pivot information is available, we want to show it. So we can say, I'm totally blanking on the name of the method. I think it's when pivot loaded. So when the pivot is loaded, role users, let's pass it a callback, and we'll just return this pivot expires at. So when that's available, we want to show it. All right, and again, here it's not available, but if we go back to our route, kind of get this back out of the way, back to down here where it was. In this case, we're finding a user, we're loading the roles, and so it is going to be available because we loaded that many-to-many relationship. And then we return that. When we look at the role, we get that expiration date that we wanted. All right, and we were able to define that cleanly in our role resource using the when pivot loaded to say, when that's available, I want you to give it to me. If it's not, don't even put this key in the array at all. All right, so hopefully that wasn't too muddy with that example, but pretty useful if you have information stored on your intermediate tables. All right, so that's the gist of kind of what I wanted to share with you as far as API transformations go. Does that seem pretty cool? Me and Mohammed have been working on this for the past few weeks, actually, trying to get this ready for 5.5. And some of the conditional stuff was really important for me to get in there because I feel like it didn't really feel very clean without that. And I wanted it to be this very clean solution that felt really good to use out of the box. So hopefully you enjoy that. I'll take a couple of questions since we have a few minutes. I didn't really get to take any questions at all at Laracon US, so I wanted to have a few extra minutes here to sort of answer any community questions while I'm here. So I think Frank has the box.
Could you somehow, so currently what happens is that you'll be using the resource to transform stuff when it goes out of the controller. Could you use it the other way around and include some sort of validation in there as well?
So I actually thought about that, and you could, and it would actually be pretty easy to just sort of do yourself in certain ways. So the question was, could you include validation on resources? Because I had the same thought I think you're having, where it feels like you're defining this HTTP representation of an Eloquent model, so why wouldn't you also have stuff to deal with the incoming side as well as the outgoing? And so one way, you could do it, which would be just sort of a userland way of doing it, is just having some kind of validate. Say you had validate for update here, and running the validator validate method at the end, which is going to throw an exception if it fails and bubble all the way back out. And then in your route, you could have something like, if you're using like implicit binding, say you get a user here, and you do something like this, just like that. Like you could do that in userland. I tried to think of ways to make it more automatic so that you could actually just type hint your user resource here. And I haven't quite cracked the best way to do that, because if you want to allow that, you need some way for the user resource to, I've lost track of it. You need some way of the user resource to indicate which model it's using, so that we know what model to actually pull from the database when you type hint that. And that's what started to feel sort of cumbersome to me, where I didn't really want to have to do that to put the model on every single resource, because it just felt less cool that way if I was having to do that. But there's probably a way to crack it that I just haven't figured out yet. So if you think of something, but I like the idea. Like I like where you're going with that. I think that's a cool idea that sort of merges some of the behavior of form requests in with this resource thing. So yeah, something to keep in mind for sure. Really good question.
What if your API needs to output another format than JSON, like CSV or even worse, XML or something? Could we still use any of this, or is it really specific to JSON and even more JSON API formats?
Actually, yes, you can, but I was really debating whether to even show it down here.
This was not intended to be a tricky question, actually.
Yeah. I'll show it to you, but I don't make any guarantees that it will be in the final version of 5.5, because I'm still undecided. But what it would look like is there's actually a make response command that makes a response. And in this case, I have a user response. So you can use this as a view presenter first. Let's just talk about that aspect first before we go to like other formats. Because some people have view presenters that sort of format their data for a view, if you need formatting helper methods. So in this case, I have a user response that works a lot like a resource. In fact, it even exists within the Illuminate HTTP resources directory. But what it looks like to return is I have this present route, and I'm going to return a new user response and pass it a user. And what it does is, in this case, toHTML just returns a view. I pass the resource on, and I can just use it like a Eloquent model, but I can also call my presenter methods as well. So I have this short name method that formats the name for some view purpose, let's say. And if I call that, then I get the view, and here's that formatted last name that was called from the presenter. So you can use it in that way as like a sort of quasi-view presenter responsible thing. But you can actually do also interesting, tricky things, which I'm not endorsing in any way, where let's say you had another format you wanted to respond to, like CSS, for example, or something weird like that. I keep losing track of like all my files. But I could add that as well. So I can add like any format that the request format method returns. So in this case, for toCSS, I'm going to check if the user is an admin. I'm going to return some different CSS here, some blue CSS here, and return the response, because this is all built on top of that one responsible interface. So now, if I return this same response from the web, I get the HTML. But like if I were to go into Postman and change this accept header to CSS and hit the actual right route called present, then I'm going to get whatever I requested from the server. So you can actually use this to present other formats. I want to like iron it out a bit more, and that's why I was kind of hesitant to show you, because I think it is a cool feature and you could use it to serve CSV, XML, CSS, HTML, whatever, using sort of one object. It's kind of like that Rails method that's like format, and then you pass it different formats and callbacks and stuff. But anyway, yeah, it is possible, but I don't know if it will be in the final release, or I may take another few weeks to sort of iron it out and then ship it out like at a later date if it makes sense. But another really good question that I was hiding from you all down in the depths of my file. And I had another example down here too, where you could actually do a collection. Like, say you had I named these sort of poorly, but you could name this like user listing or it's kind of like a named view in a way, like that's an actual object. So I have this user listing view or whatever, and in that response I can also have helper methods for that view to check if the collection has any admins, and then in my view, my user index, I can call those helper methods. So it works like a presenter, again, when you're messing with collections. But you can also do interesting things with that, where I have like a dashboard that has maybe several sub-views, and I can return those or pass those to the view just as objects. And then in my dashboard, I just sort of echo them out like variables. So that's another way to use it. But yeah, give me a few weeks to kind of think on that more, because the API side is more fleshed out, but I feel like the non-JSON side of things and mixed formats is not quite as fleshed out yet.
Can you use, it would be really useful to use this sort of thing with resources that aren't necessarily backed by Eloquent models? Mm-hmm. And how would you go about doing that if it's possible?
It works the same way. Like, the fact that they were Eloquent models was just sort of coincidence in this case, but any object would work. It's not really tied to Eloquent in any way. The only thing that was a little tied to Eloquent was when I returned that fresh model and it gave a 201 response automatically. That was the only thing that was sort of Eloquent aware. Everything else was just straightforward PHP and objects and stuff. So yeah, it should be fine. Cool. Spark is ready to go with 5.5 actually. So we'll probably be able to release it like next week, but I'm also wanting to I have a designer that works for me part-time now, which I didn't have actually when I built Spark. So his name's Steve, and that's who was just updating files in Dropbox. But I want to put him on it a little bit too, and sort of maybe refresh the UI some, do some stuff there. And I'm still trying to get into the Stripe beta for like the European credit card stuff. I think it's like SEPA or something like that, which I'm not in that yet. So there's stuff I'd like to do. It definitely will be ready for 5.5 in the next week or so, and then some visual refreshes, but then also some of the payment stuff I think I want to do. And then Mohammed also wants to add localization to it, which he's already started working on. So those are the things coming up. All right, so I guess that's it for the conference today. I really enjoyed being here, even though I'm uber tired. And I really look forward to seeing y'all all tomorrow, and the after party is going to be fun tomorrow. I'll be at that. And thanks for listening. Thanks for coming, and have a good night.